Greetings everyone. Today we're going to explore completing the square. This is a method of solving a quadratic, specifically when it's not factorable. Let's start off with some steps, which are available on the front of your foldable. If you don't have the foldable, make sure you jot these down in your notebook. The first goal is we want to make sure it's in standard form and that the leading coefficient is 1. If it's not 1, then we need to divide by a factor to make it 1. Step 2 is we're going to move our c value to the other side of the equation. Step 3 is what's going to be new. We're going to complete the square on the left and add that value to both sides. Step 4, by completing the square, we've created a factorable problem on the left side, and we're going to solve using square roots. And step 5, just a little reminder, don't forget about the plus minus when solving by square rooting. All right, let's put these steps into action with this first example. This example's written in standard form. It's equal to 0, and the leading coefficient is 1. So we're going to start off with step 2. We're going to move that c value to the other side of the equation. Now when I do this, I have to subtract it over, and I'm going to leave some space. I want that blank space in there where it did exist before. Step 3, this is the new step. We're going to complete the square. To complete the square, you're going to take your b value, you're going to divide it by 2 and square it. Maybe consider jotting that down on the front of the note sheet as well. So our b value is 4. We're going to say 4 divided by 2 and square it, which gets me back to 4. Now that I have that value, I'm going to add that 4 to both sides of the equation. So here's why I left that space. What you do to one side, you can do to the other side. We could add any value we want to both sides technically without a problem. I'm choosing 4 because look at that left side now. That left side is factorable. So let's factor. X squared plus 4x plus 4 factors down to x plus 2, x plus 2. Let's bring down the right side. The right side, negative 1 plus 4, simplifies down to 3. Now, notice how those factors are the same. They always will be with completing the square. So ideally, we should actually write that factor once and write it squared. Because now it looks like the other problems we've been working on in the previous lessons. I'm going to solve by square roots. I'm going to square root both sides, which gets me to plus and negative square root of 3. Reduce the radical if necessary. And my last step, I ran out of room here. I'm going to subtract that 2 to the other side. And remember how we write it out front. So I'm going to have a negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. All right, let's try again. We still have a leading coefficient of 1. It's in standard form, and it's equal to 0. The first thing I'm going to do is kick that c value to the other side by subtracting it, by undoing it. I'm going to complete the square. That means I take my b term, I divide by 2 and square it. Negative 6 squared is positive 36. I'm going to add 36 to both sides. What that does is creates a pretty easy number on the right side, and that left side will always be a binomial squared. If it is not, you need to go back to the completing the square step. The whole point is to arrive at a binomial that is squared. Okay, so if I factor that, I have x minus 6, x minus 6. But I'm going to write it squared so I can start solving. Instead of squaring, we're going to square root both sides. That leaves me with a positive and negative square root of 32, which reduces 32, breaks down to 16 and 2. So square root of 16 is 4 radical 2. Don't forget that plus minus. And I'm going to add 6 to the other side. Remember, when we do that, we write it in front of the positive negative symbol. So our solution is x equals 6, positive or negative, for radical 2. Alrighty, let's take a look at an example where a is not 1. So we're going to add in an additional step here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to divide every term by that a value. So if I divide everything by 2, then I've created a quadratic that looks like all the others so far and is much easier to work with. Now, because I took 0 divided by 2, it just remains 0, so we're good to go. Let's move our c value to the other side of the equation by subtracting it. And let's complete the square. We want to take our b value, cut it in half, and square it, which leads me back to a positive 4. So we're going to add 4 to both sides again. That left side will factor down to x plus 2, x plus 2. So we're going to write x plus 2 squared. Remember, this has to happen that way. That's the whole point of completing the square. We're going to square root both sides. I'm square rooting a negative, which means I have an imaginary value that I need to deal with. And I'm going to subtract that 2 to the other side. So negative 2 plus or minus I radical 3. Make sure it's written in that order. The constant should remain out front. The I is attached to the square root of 3. Also, don't forget that you might have to reduce the radical at the same time. So your simplifying steps might be pretty involved. If you need help with simplifying, please see our previous videos. One thing we don't have an example of in our notes, there might be one on the you do side, but let's look at an example where when you divide by the a value, it doesn't divide out nice. So for example, let's say I have a 3x squared plus 5x plus 9 equals 0. If I divide everything by 3, whoops, sorry about that, I would have an x squared plus 5/3 x plus 3 equals 0. So let's go about the steps the same way. We're going to kick that c value to the other side. Now, when I work on completing the square, normally we divide b by 2 and square it, right? So I have 5/3 divided by 2. Well, we don't divide by 2, we multiply by the reciprocal, right? So I'm going to have 5/6 squared. Do you see how I got that? 5 times 1, 3 times 2. So I'm going to have 25/36. I'm going to add 25/36. You might be thinking this is kind of crazy, but it works out in the end, I promise. 25/36. All right. So now here comes the part we have to think about. I want to factor that. And you might be thinking, how do I factor that? Meaning, what times itself, here's what I'm looking at, what times itself gets me to 25/36? Well, that's easy, 5/6, right? 5/6 plus 5/6 would get me 5/3. 5/6 times 5/6 is 25/36. Now look at this. Here's the shortcut way. Where did 5/6 come from? b divided by 2. b divided by 2 will always get you your factor, okay? You don't have to remember that, but it does make it easy when you're dealing with fractions. That right side, we do have a little bit of work, right? -3/1. I need a common denominator, so I'm going to have a common denominator of 36. Bear with me, right? So we're trying to add 25/36, which means I need 36 as my denominator. So that means I'm going to take 3 times 36, so 108. That's a negative, right? All right, so -108 plus 25 gets me -83/36. Seems a little crazy, right? But bear with, because now when I go to solve and I square root both sides, I've got this nice clean left side. And look at, I can square root bottom and top, and this should always happen. The bottom is a perfect square. Oops, and I shouldn't have taken a negative out. That would become an I. So a positive and negative I square root of 83. Now, you might need to try and reduce that numerator. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It just depends. And in this case, nothing divides it. So we're going to leave it as 83. So now when I subtract 5/6 to the other side, we write it out front. Plus and minus I radical 83 over 6. So the process is the same. You just have to multiply and add fractions. And when you factor, b divided by 2 will become your factor. Okay, make it a little easier on yourself. All right, so as always, make sure you check out Google Classroom. If you have extra notes problems to finish, work on that. Make sure you ask questions. Check out the Sabre Center if you need any targeted help. And until next time, have a good one.